Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Hi, everybody. We are here for this next session in the day 3 of the Peralta Online Equity Conference. I'm here with Adam Hill, Xandi, right? Did I pronounce that correctly? And Marva Dixon, who are going to talk about applying accessibility and universal design for learning principles to backward design for online learning. But before we start, I'd like to just go over a couple housekeeping tips. Some of you may choose to use the captions, which you can locate in the captions button in the bottom of the Zoom window. Sometimes they're hidden under the More button with the 3 dots. And so you just have to click that More button. You'll see a menu with the captions option to open that up. Next, these are workshops today, so they're highly interactive, and our team has put together a really active workshop, but I also encourage you to use the chat with any comments or questions that you have that you may not want to wait until there's an opportunity to voice that question or comment. Last, we're being recorded, so if you don't wish to have yourself captured in any way, you're free to change your name or keep your camera off, whatever you're most comfortable doing. And with that, I'm going to put myself on mute and hand the microphone over to Adam, Xandi, and Marva.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for being here. We are so excited to share and learn with you. So if you haven't already, we encourage you to answer the poll that's up right now. Include your name and pronouns if you wish in the chat, your location, and a subject that you that was taught creatively in your past learning experience. And with that, I'll go to the next slide. I'm actually going to end the poll after the next slide, so get it in quickly, and we'll return to this in a second. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about a resource we've collaborated on for many months called the Design Playbook for Accessible Learning. And in that, what we're doing is applying accessibility principles to universal design principles to the backward design process. So on the next slide, we have our agenda. So we're right now in this overview and welcome period. Following that, we will give you an introduction to the playbook. It'll probably last about 20 minutes, and then we'll go into the workshop part where we'll do a case study application that we're really excited about, and we'll save about the last 10 minutes for a debrief. So on the next slide, a brief introduction to us. My name is Adam Hill. I use he, him pronouns. I am a senior learning designer at 2U or edX, which is an online learning company. And I'm based in Oakland, California. And I'm also a master's student in San Francisco State's Instructional Design and Technology program. And I'll pass it on to Xandi.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So I am also a senior learning strategist at 2U/edX and based usually just outside of Chicago, although I did grow up in Northern California, and I'm actually back visiting family at this moment, so I'm not too far down the street. But in my work, both at edX and outside, I also do a lot of work specifically around digital equity and digital inclusion, which comes up frequently when we're thinking about designing for small A accessibility for a wide variety of learners. With that, I'll pass to Marva.
Hi, my name is Marva Dixon. I use she, they pronouns. I am based in Cleveland, Ohio, so on the other side of the country. But I've been at 2U for about 5 years now, and before joining 2U, I was a teacher. I taught mostly middle and high school, and I've taught in the US, I've taught in South Africa, and I've taught in France. Okay, so the design playbook for accessible learning, which is what we'll be talking about a lot here, was created because we at 2U edX realized that we needed a set of unified standards to support the creation of accessible learning experiences. So this design playbook is what we use. It's our guide for creating these inclusive and accessible learning experiences to make sure that accessibility is something that's infused throughout the learning experience from the very start of the design process. So there is a document format of this playbook, which is what you're looking at on the screen. There is also a more interactive version of the playbook, and we'll make sure to send you links to both of those formats at the end of this presentation. But inside, you'll find evidence-based principles, you'll find real-world examples, and you'll also find actionable insights that we hope you'll be able to incorporate into your learning experiences immediately. Okay, so looking at the poll, it looks like there's definitely some familiarity with backward design, which is great. And then there are some folks who this is new to, which totally understand. So a quick explainer on backward design. With backward design, you start with the learning objectives and determining those. And then once you do that, you move on to assessments that are created based on those learning objectives that you determine. And then you create instructional experiences based on the objectives and the assessments. So in doing research on backward design, one of the challenges or criticisms that we kept coming across was its lack of accommodation for student diversity. With backward design, you often are you're often asking students to embark on the same educational path or an educational path that's super similar. So there's just not a lot of room for student diversity. So due to the criticisms that we came across with backward design, we looked at some other learning design frameworks, and the main one that we looked at was Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. And Universal Design for Learning wants to create flexible learning experiences that ideally can be used by all students. So it encourages multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and also multiple means of action and expression. In addition to UDL, we also consulted some other frameworks which were asked about in the poll. Student-centered learning, which, as the name implies, centers students in the learning, and also the social model of disability, as well as the cultural model of disability. So looking at our objectives for today, we would like to interrogate the limitations of backward design for reaching all learners. We also want to identify barriers to learning in traditional online course designs and recognize the benefits of applying UDL principles. And lastly, we would like to apply principles of UDL and accessibility to backward design to promote a more accessible and inclusive course. So looking at the way the playbook is formatted, if you look at steps 1, 2, and 3, you'll see that those align with backward design, with starting with the objectives, then moving on to assessments, and then finishing with instruction or instructional activities. But one thing that we came across is we felt that there was an additional step that occurs before the traditional backward design steps. And with that step, that's when you look at assumptions that you make about learners, as well as assumptions that you make about learning experiences. So that's where step 0 comes into play. So Adam and Xandi are going to be walking us through those steps. And as they walk us through the steps, we invite you to think about which one of these you would like to engage with further. As Adam mentioned, we'll have an opportunity to join breakout rooms at the end of the presentation. So the breakout rooms will be based on these steps. So just think about which of these steps you want to tackle a little bit further in those breakout rooms. So with that, we are going to move on to step 0, and I'm going to pass it to Xandi.
Thank you, Marva, and hi everyone again. And yes, so of course, usually when we have multiple steps, we usually start with step 1. We identified that there was actually sort of a preceding step before we can get into identifying learning objectives, because we almost never actually come into designing a learning experience with a truly blank slate. Like we know absolutely nothing about the context, and we're starting purely from objectives. So this step 0 is focused on identifying what we actually know or what the constraints are up front, and then also what assumptions are we making about those constraints or about the design process that might be limiting accessibility for learners. So we've broken those down into 2 pieces. First of all, understanding who are your learners, who are we designing for? And then secondly, what are the design constraints of the learning experience? We'll unpack each of those a little bit further. So when we talk about who are your learners, and again, all of this is sort of a high level summary of things that we go into in a lot more detail in the playbook, but we want to give you the right level of detail to be able to start putting this into practice in our workshop today. So 3 questions to ask yourself about your learners. These are drawn partly from our experience, but also partly from the book Design for How People Learn by Julie Dirksen. And those are, what do your learners want? Meaning partly why are they here? What brings them to this experience? What is their current skill level? And this third one I think is really insightful and crucial in my opinion. How are they different from you? We all bring our own lived experiences and our own expertise to this design process. And our learners are not us. That's why they are the learners and not the designers. And so we need to be very intentional about recognizing those differences and incorporating that into the design process. As we think about this, we've identified a sort of a framing of what do I know is going to be true for all of the learners that I expect to encounter, and then where can I expect variation? So things that might be true for every learner for a course that you're designing hypothetically would be, they're all going to be admitted students at this college, for example. If you're designing an online class, they all registered for an online class. We could, maybe they wanted an online class, maybe they didn't, but they did all at least choose or sign up for one. And you might also know something like, in order to attend this course or enroll in this course, there's a prerequisite or there's a sort of a screening process that we can make some assumptions about. So we've left, and you'll see in a lot of places in our slides, we've left sort of blank spaces because these are examples, not an exhaustive list. And you'll all be having some great conversations a little bit later about other things that might go into these categories. But we want to also think about, where can I assume that my learners are going to vary widely, and how can I design for that variation rather than trying to make assumptions about a so-called average learner. So we know that our learners are going to vary by typically age, life stage, outside responsibilities, what brought them to this class, their disability or ability status. We could go on and on here. But so being intentional about identifying the ways that your learners will differ from one another is one way that we can start planning for that accessibility from the very beginning. Once we've done some thinking about learners, we then also want to tackle, what do I know about this learning experience that I'm creating? And similarly, we can break this down into, what do I definitely know? What has to be true? And then what am I assuming, or maybe using sort of a mental shortcut for, but that doesn't actually have to be true as part of the design constraints for this? And are there alternatives that I could be thinking about? So for example, again, if we're designing, say a class for a community college context, we might be given some constraints around the number of credit hours, the term length. We might know upfront whether it's going to be a fully online version or if there might be a hybrid or a high flex. So these are examples of things that we might know going in. And then there are a lot of other things that we might assume or sort of like mentally make a mental shortcut to, or use as a design heuristic that doesn't actually have to be the case. So for instance, I might assume I'm going to assign a textbook and I'm going to give them readings out of the textbook every week. I'm going to do lecture with slides, and my students are going to write assignments and submit them, and I will grade them. And all of those are very common and sometimes useful heuristics or shortcuts that we use, but they don't have to be the case. And for the folks who, I saw some folks in the chat mentioning previous experience with UDL conversations, you're probably already thinking about, what are some other ways that we could provide multiple options rather than only sticking to just that one. So that's our step 0, is really intentionally thinking through those pieces before we get into objectives. Next, we do want to, of course, dive into those objectives. And we could do a whole other workshop on writing strong learning objectives, and we won't do that today. But we do want to think about, how does framing the learning objectives intentionally help to make the finished learning experience more accessible to more learners? So we're probably mostly familiar with the idea that learning objectives should answer this question: what should learners be able to do afterwards that they couldn't do before? And you've likely also heard this next general advice, that your learning objectives should be, there we go, relevant, student-centered, and based on observable behavior. So again, this itself is probably not new framing for most of us, But we want to think about, okay, why are those the criteria? And specifically, how do those criteria help to ensure that the objectives are fair and are accessible to as many students as possible? So one way to look at that is to say, what happens when they don't meet that criteria? So that can create obstacles like some of the ones that are on this slide. We won't try to talk through all of these, although all of these are addressed in the playbook. But for example, when we have learning objectives that are not based on observable criteria or observable behavior, then we end up with invisible outcomes, with things that we as instructors are making a judgment call on whether we think the student has done that or not, and where we have students who are trying to guess at how they can demonstrate that they have learned that without really having a clear sense of what's expected. Similarly with learning objectives that maybe are not actually relevant or as relevant as they should be to the material. Sometimes that leads to things like hidden curricula. So building in value judgments or cultural and social norms into your objectives that are not actually directly stated and that maybe don't even belong in the objectives of that course. So this comes up a lot when we see things like demonstrates professionalism in the classroom, right? That can be a very loaded term that's not very clearly defined. So when we get into the case study, you'll get a chance to do some workshopping of learning objectives if you choose step 1 to work on. But these are just a couple of examples of ways that might show up. So, on this next slide, and I was mid-edit and did not finish making my edits, so that's fun. But two other things that are included in the playbook is also working through your objectives to understand which of these objectives that I'm working on can stand alone and which of them should be, the cliffhanger there is thoughtfully scaffolded in order to clearly support one another. And then if they're going to be scaffolded, how do I need to build in that structure as part of my, my learning design? All right, so with that, let's dive into step 2, and I will hand that off to Adam to discuss further.
Thank you, Xandi. So now we'll cover some of the main points in our playbook around assessment. This is a pretty meaty topic of our playbook, so I'll focus on like a high-level overview and some of the core recommendations that will really apply to the workshop component. So on the next slide, we talk about some accessibility challenges with the traditional assessment. And assessment is really ultimately about evidence of learning, right? It's about getting learners to demonstrate to themselves and to their instructor that they've learned something and met the desired objectives. However, we often end up creating barriers to learning through a rigid assessment design. So an over-reliance on one method can create barriers to access. For example, an over-reliance on exams might overemphasize test-taking skills, presentations, public speaking skills, papers, writing skills. And the problem here is that learners are unable to demonstrate that they've learned in a way that suits them. And this isn't to say that one assessment method is bad on its own, but rather that a reliance on one without flexibility for students can just become a limiting factor. And this is probably especially true with exams. We've also seen like the high pressure environment for exams, especially in like weeder courses in the sciences, can limit access to students enrolling in those courses and ultimately limit access to certain professions. Another challenge we see is this kind of one-shot environment, this lack of growth that can be seen in some assessment designs. And so there's a lack of feedback, there's a lack of explicit reattempt opportunities, and this can just deprioritize growth and development and kind of undermine some of the reasons we're in education to begin with. So on the next slide, we have some ways to address this to make your assessment designs more accessible, which are things like providing reasonable options for students to demonstrate learning within an assignment, designing assessments that mirror real-world scenarios, which can really help boost motivation, and prioritizing growth and feedback in your assessment design as well. So some examples of this on the next slide are things like when you offer options, consider maybe a way to have a paper, a presentation, podcast, or other medium that still meets the standards for your assessment. Moving away from exams if you can, maybe converting an exam to a project or portfolio-based experience. Really prioritizing growth, thinking about ways you can prioritize feedback in your assessment process and an opportunity to reattempt something without a penalty. And lastly, another thing, and there's more ideas here that you can explore if you decide to join this part of the workshop, is real world application, thinking about ways to consider learning context beyond academic settings. Do you have to have a scholarly paper for every one of your assignments if a student's motivation is not ultimately to go into academia? All right, so that was just part of what we covered. That's kind of more related to our workshop topics, but there's more in the playbook. Things like strategies to promote alternative grading or ungrading in your course, strategies for creating an accessible learning environment if you must use exams, and considerations before you integrate proctoring software in your course. We know that proctoring software is becoming a big issue in online learning. All right, we're almost to that workshop. Lastly, I'll talk about instruction. So this is also a pretty meaty topic. I'll get to kind of the main points here. On the next slide, some of the challenges we see when it comes to accessible online instruction are really rigid delivery methods that create challenges for neurodiverse learners or different learning preferences. If maybe there's a lot of text in a learner, that's not a great way for them to learn. So thinking about ways to open up those delivery pathways. We also see technology barriers as a big challenge too, that students with either limited access to high-speed internet or are mainly learning on a mobile device, this can be a challenge for them when they're learning online. And finally, a topic that's continuing to be discussed right now is digital literacy gaps and how that makes an impediment for online learning. So some ways to address this are offering multiple pathways to deliver instructional content, also providing more flexible learning materials, and ensuring content meets minimal accessibility standards. Some examples of this on the next slide are things like, this is really about flexibility, getting to the idea of multiple from UDL. So providing a list of resources that students can choose based on their learning preferences and interests. So maybe you have, here's some videos, a podcast, and a reading. Choose 2 out of the 5 or 3 out of the 5. With flexibility, something like ensuring that you have accessible versions of your readings so that they can be read by a screen reader. That's not just helpful for students with visual impairments, but also for anyone that might prefer to read using a text-to-speech software. Also, multiple modes of instruction. If your institution can accommodate it, something like a high flex mode is really cool, where you can have a synchronous or an asynchronous option for different learning preferences. And kind of related to that with technology barriers, thinking about ways, if you have a synchronous only online course, can you have for presentations the option for async presentations for some students that just simply won't be able to provide a quality synchronous presentation based on internet access. More ideas there that we encourage you to tackle if you join the Step 3 breakout. And so also included in the playbook, just as a preview, if you want to dive in further, we provide you with a reflective exercise to break out of a rut if you feel like all your courses are kind of looking the same online. More strategies for incorporating content-specific accessibility principles, kind of that big A accessibility stuff like alt text, video captions. And we also link out to some embedded resources from things like the WCAG standards and some offices of accessibility at different universities. So there we go. That's our playbook high level. I'm going to pass it off to Xandi so we can get to this fun part of the workshop.
Thank you, Adam. So yes, we really wanted to make sure that folks get a chance to try this and hopefully try this in a very safe space where you're not yet trying to pick apart your own work, but maybe taking on a new hypothetical assignment. So congratulations, you all have a new assignment, which is to revise and teach a course called Communication 122, Business Communication. This is just a little bit of a teaser on this slide and actually I can drop this link now, I think. In the activity guide, which we've just linked in the chat, you'll get lots more information about what are the goals of this course and about your assignment. So in general, we encourage you to read through the overall case study details, and then as you've chosen your breakout room, then you'll have some additional specifics to tackle as well. So on the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about what that will look like, and then we'll turn everybody loose. So there's a brief preview of the workshop activity guide that you'll find at that link. As we said, we want everybody to choose the breakout room associated with the step that you're most interested in practicing. And I'd encourage you in this hopefully safe space to choose one that feels challenging for you, right? We want this to be an opportunity to discuss with other colleagues who are in this space, to hear different ideas that you might not get exposed to otherwise. So with your group in that document, we're all going to be using the same document as kind of a shared workbook. We recommend that you identify one or more people in your group to take notes and to help fill in the points of discussion. And then come back hopefully prepared to share. We'd love to have a larger group conversation about how this activity went, what you learned, any questions that this surfaces as you work through. So with that, the link again is in the chat. I'll drop it one more time just in case. And then I think we should have our breakout rooms coming up momentarily. All right. Let's see. So, and Kevin, do we have those breakout rooms set up, or should I do that? Okay, excellent. Thank you.
We do, and if you want me to open those rooms for you, if you're not able to do it as co-host, then I'll do it right now.
Great. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Yes, I think that
And
I was
people
able to.
can choose their own.
Work beautiful. Yep, that's exactly right. Okay, so everybody should be able to see if you go and click on the three dots button for more and then find breakout rooms, you'll see the list of steps 0, 1, 2, and 3, each of them with a button that says join. You can choose which one you want to join. In terms of time, we'll spend about 10 minutes here. So, and Adam and Marva and I will probably pop into those rooms briefly, check in on how things are going, answer questions if need be, but we do want to prioritize time at the end for us to come back and regroup. So, okay, we'll see you there.
And I will stay here to be the traffic moderator. Keep in mind, in the room for step 2, Joan, she's with a sign language interpreter, but she may need, she'll let you know if she needs something, I guess is the best way to put it.
Great.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. And if you're still figuring out how to join those breakout rooms, those steps once again are, if you look down at the bottom menu for the 3 dots and the menu that says more, then look for the menu option for breakout rooms. That should pull up a list for you of the 4 available rooms to choose from. So we won't be automatically assigning folks into breakout rooms. You get to pick which one you want. Okay, looks like we've got a few folks still hanging out in the main room, that's fine. Also, if you're not in a place where it's easy for you to participate in a breakout room, I know sometimes that can be challenging. So one thing we might do actually, Kevin, which we didn't specifically discuss, is maybe pause the recording during this part, since it will probably
That
not
sounds good. I'll do
capture
that now.
anything. Great, thank you.
And then do you want me to start the slide deck again?
Yes, awesome,
Okay.
thank you. Okay, so as we're getting that pulled up, hopefully everybody got a chance to have a good conversation in their breakout rooms about the step that you chose. We would love to do a short group debrief. So if there are folks, I don't know if every group got a chance to sort of to talk through what they would want to share or to nominate somebody, but also, you know, would just invite folks who feel comfortable doing so to share in 1 to 2 minutes. How did that go? Were there useful takeaways that came out of your discussion? Feel free to answer any of the questions that are on this slide, and probably won't be able to try to answer all of them. So anybody feeling brave and want to come off of mute?
I like the process of really looking at a real course. I do a lot of professional development workshops for faculty, and in fact, I'm doing one on Friday, and I've I've been doing a little bit of this, and I think it's really effective to be able to look at someone else's course, that's sort of relevant, and it brings up good questions. And I think it also allows people to sort of be like, oh, I'm doing that in my class, but I don't have to admit it. I can just learn from it. Yeah.
Yes, and yeah, absolutely. It's the opportunity to critique an example before you get into the more vulnerable work of trying to really apply that to your own teaching, I think can be a really good kind of bridge to that. That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think I saw we had a fairly good sized group in the step 0 and step 2 rooms for the assumptions and assessments. If anybody from one of those groups wants to share.
I'll jump in and share for assessments. Our conversation kind of centered around, well, first it started off about instructional design, but then we segued into thinking out of the box when it comes to assessments, because we kind of default into kind of like paper, quiz, discussion board if you're doing online, rinse, repeat, and that does get boring for students. So really thinking about what are ways we can reuse tools we already have access to, but maybe in a different way. One example that came up was if you use the Office 365 suite, there's Microsoft Forms. And one year I built a choose your own adventure with using Microsoft Forms just to make it more engaging, more entertaining, but also helping students assess what they learned. So that was our discussion.
I love that. Well, and that sounds like that probably also gets closer to a sort of an authentic assessment of like decision making, rather than write a paper describing how you would make a decision. Yeah, that's great. Great example.
And it's also a really cool example to show how someone else might use this going forward, or how they might integrate it into their assessments going forward. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Anybody from the step 0 group feel brave to share a little bit about how that conversation went, including if you had lots of questions and would like to surface those questions in this space. We want to hold space for that as well.
Yes, I would. This is Lrng, and this was business related, and I'm a very beginning low ESL instructor. So my assumptions for this particular issue were probably not relevant. I shared them anyway, but my group, my students barely know their own language and they are in my class. So my assumptions are different from what the list would be. So other than that, I'll be happy to answer your questions. But thank you for the time.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. And yeah, that's an angle that we absolutely want to think about. I didn't mention this in our lead up at the beginning, but I also am a writing and an English instructor, and thinking about to what extent do we need to insist on a particular level and type of English language communication even in a communications class, versus the ability to include things like, you are a speaker of multiple languages, let's use that to your advantage. Let's bring your bilingual or bicultural strengths into your business communication if that's relevant for you. I think that's something that I would love to see more of, and that can be part of identifying those assumptions.
Xandi, I do address all these things, and my assumptions are totally 0 because they all are at different levels of learning in their lives, never mind their educational background. So when I teach at this level, I have to think of 100 different things with assumptions and assessments. So assessment can be 0 for one person and 5 for somebody else. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, well, and that's actually, I love that point because you're identifying exactly the kind of like surfacing those assumptions and the knowns and unknowns that are going to vary widely from, a beginning ESOL class to a business communication class to a, college algebra class, for example. So identifying those assumptions intentionally rather than holding them without examining them, I think is a big part of that step 0 approach.
Thank you, Xandi.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone who shared. We really appreciate your time. I know we're coming up on our time here, so we want to wrap up and make sure that you all get access to some resources as well.
Yeah, so I think in our last minute, we just wanted to thank you all for attending this workshop. Thank you for your engagement. We want to hear from you. We're kind of learning along with you on this. This is something that's new for us too. So what we have done is we have created a link tree that we will share now in the chat. It's also on the Peralta Equity Conference website under the description for our session. And in there, you will find a link to the playbook, like a document version, as well as like an interactive version in Notion. There's also a feedback form. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can also use that to provide your contact information to stay in touch with us. You can do two separate ones of those if you want to make sure your feedback's anonymous. There's a link to our team's webpage if you want to learn more about us. We also invite you to email us directly if you want to stay in touch. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you,
Well,
everyone.
I'd just like to, on behalf of the conference and all the participants here, thank Adam, Xandi, and Marva for sharing this wonderful set of resources, for leading us through conversations. As I was saying when we were paused, you're introducing ideas that some of us, even familiar with backward design, haven't really formalized, even if we consider aspects of those assumptions, really just giving us practical how-tos on how to make our students' lives a little better. So we appreciate that. And as Adam mentioned, the link is already on the website, and later on the recording will be too. There is Jayshri next presentation at the top of the hour, so stay tuned. I'm going to stop the recording and I'll put the link to the YouTube channel in the chat.